Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Joy Warland, and I am the consultant for continuing education and small and rural libraries at the Vermont Department of Libraries. Thank you for joining us for this session on board management with guest presenter Sarah Henshaw. This is the last live session of our week-long conference, so please remember to fill out an evaluation for us. There's a link to it on our website, and we'll put that in the chat as well. We hope you've had a great week. We have had a very good week. We've learned a lot. We've really enjoyed interacting with people in these in-person sessions or these live sessions. Remember that everything has been recorded, so you can go back and see ones you didn't get a chance to go to or re-see some of the ones that you did attend. And the slides and handouts are on our website as well. So we're just very grateful for everybody that's attended this week, all the people that have come in person, and also who are going to watch on the recordings later. We're just also, as a profession, so grateful to trustees and friends of the library, all of you that are doing this hard work on volunteer basis for your libraries. And so such important work, and we as librarians couldn't do what we do without you. So thank you for that and your interest in continuing education and attending things like this. So I'm excited to have Sarah Henshaw here with us today. I just have a brief intro to her. Sarah Henshaw is the founder of Leaves of Change Vermont. She brings over 20 years of successfully developing the capacity of non-government organizations, communities, and human resources in both an international and domestic United States setting. Sarah started her career as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nicaragua, where her commitment to local communities was sparked. Through collaboration with communities and organizations in over 20 countries, including the United States, Sarah has seen the power of people and organizations to change and fulfill their dreams. So thank you for being here, Sarah, and you're on.
Great, thank you, Joy. One logistical thing, just want to make sure everything's good with my presentation. Everybody can see that. You can see it, Joy?
Yes, I can. Sorry,
okay,
I was getting my mic back on. Yes.
No worries, just want to make sure. So thank you so much. I'm really honored to have been invited to talk to you all today about board management. It's not the most sexy or exciting topic, but it's something that I think can really make or break an organization. Kind of the army of the engaged volunteers, something that I think is really important that happens behind the scenes of any nonprofit. The introduction was great. The one thing that I would want to add just in terms of a personal story is I've grown up with libraries around me my entire life. And so I was really excited to be able to talk to you all today because of my love of libraries. My mother was a librarian and I grew up going to the library every day, every week to visit my mom and to pick up books. And when I lived overseas and had my children, one of the saddest things was that there wasn't many libraries to bring my kids to when they were really little. And so when we first moved back to Vermont, I took my kids to the library. It's something that I'd been talking to them about and was like, look, this is a library. And sat there. I proceeded to sit there and cry because I was so excited. And my kids were like, they're just books, Mom. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it. What I'm going to talk about today is board management. I like to frame the idea of what it means to be a board member or a trustee or a friend more as an ambassador. And I just take a second to kind of put that out there and to have you guys all think about, what does ambassador mean to you? If you have any thoughts, feel free to add them to the chat and we can read them out. The reason I choose this word, as you'll get to see, is that the dictionary definition, if you go to the dictionary, an ambassador is a person who acts as a representative or promoter of a specific activity. So I like the idea of an ambassador being the promoter and the representative of your library or of the organization, the nonprofit you're working for. It changes slightly from being kind of a passive board member to an active ambassador and somebody who's actively, working to promote and be excited for and get excitement for that library. So that's kind of how I will frame this entire conversation today. Throughout the conversation, I will be presenting kind of 3 pieces of what it means to be an ambassador and how you really build that ambassadorship at the board level. And in each one of those kind of 3 pieces, there's different tools that I will be talking about. They're all just suggestions and recommendations. They all need to be adapted for the uniqueness of whatever your library setting is or your board setting is. And they're all on the conference website, so you can take a look and use them and play with them and change them as needed. At the end of each one of those kind of pieces, I will open it up for questions, just in case there's questions about that particular piece or those particular tools. And yeah, those are all the things I wanted to talk about. So we're going to move on to the first kind of piece of what it means to be an ambassador and how do you build that ambassadorship. These are the three pieces I was talking about. We have the first is kind of the intentional recruiting of new members. We'll talk about what that means versus just regular recruitment, and some of the ways that you can actually start to build a group of people that complement each other and can help each other out as this group of ambassadors on the board. And I know that in small towns, I live in a small town, it can be very challenging to find a group of people. So we can talk a little bit about some of those challenges that might come up and ways around them. The next is, once you have that amazing group and you've recruited, how do you assess them, the board members' ability to do their own jobs, and how do you assess the board if they're doing well or not doing well, and how do you use that assessment to kind of create a path towards improving the excitement and the promotion and the ability to be this ambassador for the organization. And then the last piece is, once you've kind of made sure you have a great group of people and they're all really moving together along a path. What kind of materials do they need to actually be able to be out there in the community and engage with the community and do promotion and to do marketing? So I'll have a little just kind of set of tools for that. The one thing I'll do is stop right here and just say this is really around that the idea of the ambassadorship is complementary to the other pieces and roles that some boards might play. So some boards probably have a governance function or a fiduciary oversight function. So I'm not talking as much about those particular functions, but if there are questions about those two kind of functions, feel free to ask me at the end because they are important roles that the boards may play. So the first thing we're going to talk about is intentional recruitment. And I use the word intentional very specifically because a lot of times, and I don't know if this is going to sound familiar, but a lot of boards, what happens, especially in small towns and especially with small organizations, you have 4 people on a board that can hold 8. And you sit around and people are like, so, I know that so-and-so is free. Her child's getting older, so she can come in and probably take over, one of the board roles, or, we really need somebody who is a mom. Oh, I know 5 moms, or, they don't have time. Okay, we can't have them. So you talk about who you know, which is great. And everybody knows somebody that's, everybody's network is incredible, right? But intentional recruitment starts before that networking and that outreach. It says, okay, on our board, we would like to have a certain set of demographics. We would like to have a certain set of skills. We'd like to have a certain set of experiences. And it maps out kind of what your board, in terms of the number of people you can have on the board, it maps out how do you take those number of people and split them into different demographics or different skills and experiences that you would like to have on the board. And if you have term limits, you can think about how do I maybe switch the demographics or the experiences or the skills on the board to fit kind of where the board needs to be to support the organization and the library. There's tools in the packet of information to kind of map that out and to start to help you think about what those kind of characteristics of different board members might be. So I'd encourage you guys to go and look if this is something that you're struggling with. Another thing that's in the packet that might help with this intentional recruitment is I know that in some smaller towns, the idea of a conflict of interest, because everybody knows each other, everybody's somehow related in terms of professions, in terms of family, in terms of experience. So I've put together kind of just a checklist of things to think about around conflict of interest that might be of interest to people who are doing that. So once you've kind of set out as a board and said, okay, these are the demographics or these are the skills that we really need to have on the board and we're missing or we'd like to, include. The next question is how do you attract those people? How do you find those people? And so the next tool that I'm going to kind of introduce is called the Army of the Engaged, and it is a exercise that individual board members do and then bring back to the board. And the intent of that exercise is kind of twofold. Both, it will help you identify potential new board members, hopefully, but it also will help you identify supporters. So people who can help with donations, people who can help with fundraising, people who might be interested in events, people who you might need to reach out to for specific activities or programs. And it's a fairly simple and straightforward exercise. And in the next slide, will show you just some questions taken from that exercise. And it's one where you would take, a board meeting, or you might assign homework between board meetings and say, can you fill out this form and think about it? And it doesn't have to be, hours and hours and hours. This is kind of a top of mind, sit down and look at these questions, go through them, jot down people that fit each one of these different categories, and then bring those to the board meeting. And once you have everybody sitting there with their lists, you can start to fit people's, people from your Army of the Engaged exercise, which we'll look at in a second, with that list of intentional categories that you're trying to recruit for. So let me just go to the next slide here. These are the types of questions. So it's a questionnaire, and you'll see, and if you open up the conference packet after this, you'll see that the Army of the Engaged is a questionnaire that has spaces for people to just fill in names of people that you know. And the types of questions that they're asking you to think about are like, who are your friends and colleagues from work? Who have you spoken to about your work at the library that has expressed genuine interest? Who are those people that when you note that you're a trustee or you're a friend on the Friends board, it's like, oh, that's really great. Tell me more. Who was it that was, with you the last 5 or 10 times you went out for a meal? I mean, I realized in COVID that might not be going out to meals much, but who did you Zoom with in the last 2 weeks? Who have you, been missing and not been able to be engaged with because we've all been on Zoom or Teams? Who are those family members that would love to support your work but may not be sitting in the same town with you? Who are some of the people you haven't seen in a while, but you might be interested just because of their profession or because of their experience? And so there's many more questions like this. There's about 15 to 20 different questions like this, just to spark that thinking about all the different people in your network that might, be a good trustee or board member, or could be somebody who could be great outreach. And these lists are powerful because they help with a lot of different moments, not just recruiting, but a lot of different moments when board members come up and they're like, well, who do you know that, do you think you might find somebody who does, and there's all those questions that come up. And so these lists, if compiled and brought together as a whole group, might help, quickly come up with some answers of people that might be useful and to reach out to. So I'm going to stop there and just see if there's any questions. Does this feel like intentional recruiting, feel like it's something that you already are doing? Is it something that you feel is new and complicated? Is this something that you think would be useful? Are there questions about how you might do that?
At this point, please feel free to write in the chat or unmute yourself using *6 if you're on the phone, or you can raise your hand if you're here in the meeting and have the little toolbar accessible. We'd love to hear from you.
All right, I will. Okay, if there's not, then I will move on, but feel free to, to put any questions in the chat as I continue.
Oh, actually, there is a comment in the chat. This is very helpful because we always do the first example of just a small discussion about potential trustees.
Yeah, and I think that's a common, all the boards that I've been on, especially the ones here in Vermont, have been, okay, so we need one more board member. Who do we know? Right. And then you kind of start with the who do you know instead of starting with the, what do we need on the board? What do we want on the board? Who do we, what voices do we are not present? And so I think stepping back one step and thinking here, I think that's an important piece of recruitment that sometimes gets lost. So thank you for that. Yes, I agree. I'll move on to the next. If I can get my screen to work, thank you. Okay, so assessments. I don't, as a volunteer, I always, feel a little bit nervous when you start to talk about assessments. I'm doing this out of the kindness of my heart and in my spare time. But I also, but at the same time, most of us would not want to have a job where we weren't told if we were doing a good job or not. We weren't given the opportunity to think about, what we want to get out of this opportunity. And I think that last piece, what do we want to get out of this opportunity and this experience? And understanding what those expectations are for ourselves on the board is really an important piece, as well as how do we as a group plan together and think through what we'd like to get done and then assess how we're going to get there. And so I think part of being a board ambassador is really having a strong sense of what I can contribute, what my expectations are as a board member, and then putting those out there with the group and saying as a group, together, what are our expectations for the next year, our expectations for this board, our expectations for, the types of support we can really offer. And then how do we take those expectations and make them into objectives and goals? And then how do we assess ourselves against that? And I think that's why I would suggest, to think about how do you actually do any assessments as a board and as individual board members? And then if you don't, how would you do that? And what would you do? This tool, the set of tools that I'm going to offer here, they definitely need to be, validated and updated for your reality. If you have bylaws that have actual, this is what a board member should, the roles and responsibilities of board members, that's a great place to start. If you have bylaws that have, this is the intention and of the board in terms of the roles and responsibility the board plays for the library, another great place to start. If you don't have those, consider putting those both in place, both in terms of roles and responsibilities of individual board members and trustee members. And there's samples of what those roles and responsibilities for individual board members might look like in the packet of information. There's also an example of, I think, of kind of how to assess the different, board members. So what I'm going to do in this particular section is I'm going to go through a couple different tools that might be useful. There's a sample self-assessment in the packet. And the self-assessment is basically similarly to they're being engaged as a bunch of questions, and it asks board members to kind of self-assess from 1 to 5 on a variety of different expectations that a board member might have for themselves and what the board might expect of that board member. They obviously need to be updated to fit the reality of your board. And this exercise probably could happen on an annual basis, just so that as board members turn over, and as board members go through like really high activity and participation versus low participation on the board, you kind of get a sense of how is the board how am I doing as a board member over time. So some of these sample questions in the self-assessment is, I consider myself a trustee or friend who is engaged in the work of the library. So, how engaged are you? Do you participate in all the meetings? Do you go to the events? Do you go to the library and check, figure out how you can support the library? The next one is, I'm an effective fundraiser or community outreach person for the library. So not all boards have the expectation of fundraising, but most boards have expectation of some sort of community outreach and getting into the community and talking about the library. That's the whole idea of the ambassadorship. I'm an active participant in strategic discussions, offering constructive, not destructive, insights or questions. And this is in particular for board meetings. In the past year, I've brought new assets. So that can be anything from the actual physical, I don't know if donations of books or other types of physical assets, but it could also be the perspectives that you might bring that are different and unique. Is your voice being given to the decisions and the path of the board? Are you offering different contacts to the board, people that within that network that you've just identified? And I frequently encourage the librarian with my words and actions. And I put that last one in there, and there are quite a few different questions on the actual tool around this, because I think a lot of times boards forget that part of their role in this ambassadorship and this being on the board is to encourage the librarians and those staff that are actually, doing the work all the time. So these sample questions, there's about 20 of them in the tool. You're asked to assess yourself from 1 to 5. 1 being like, "Ooh, I didn't even realize I could be doing that." 5 being like, "I rock this. This is amazing. I'm totally doing good at this." Once you've done that, it's great to come together as a board and talk about the things that you are either really, great at and you feel like you're really contributing, or things that you don't feel like you're contributing. And then together as a group, talk about how do you strengthen each individual board member in the areas that they're weak, if you feel that you need that, or how do the board members' weaknesses and strengths complement each other to make this really amazing board together. The second part of this assessment is around the board itself as a group. There's a self-assessment for the board as a group, and it looks at all those different roles that the board should be playing, from the ambassadorship type role to the governance roles to the fiscal oversight roles. And it's, again, the questions are asked in such a way that it's a self-assessment, so the board together can come up with a 1 to 5. How do we think we're doing? And at the end of that exercise, you can kind of look at where you're weak and strong again, and decide if the pieces where you're weak, how are you going to strengthen them? Are they important? Are they a priority right now in the board? They may not be, but they may. And together with that group board assessment with the individual board assessment, you can kind of come together and create this amazing path for how do you move together to strengthen and become this really active board that is really supporting the mission of the library. The other last piece is there's a future planning tool that is offered in the conference material that is on the website that is really nice to do after those annual meetings, the first meeting after, and think about what in the coming year would we look back together as a board and say, oh my God, we've been really successful this year. We have really achieved a lot of good. So pick 1 or 2 just points or things or activities or events or things you want to accomplish, and name them as a group. And then use that to help kind of measure how you're moving forward together as a group. And then the following year, you can look back and you can look at those 1 or 2 and say, were we able to achieve them? And if the answer is yes, celebrate, pat each other on the back. That's amazing. And if the answer is no, maybe there's good reasons why. Maybe COVID came and there was a pandemic that totally changed everything you were planning to do. Maybe, something else came up. And just to reflect on what happened is always a good way to help strengthen the board. So before I move on, I wanted to stop for a second and just look at the chat and see if there's any questions about these assessments.
So Sarah, I'm not sure the way you have your screen set up, if you can see the chat. Are you able to see it?
Yeah, on the right-hand side.
Okay, great. Yeah, because Lisa had a comment about having basically too many people apply for a position. So if you could talk a little bit about that, like how would you cull through those candidates and select the best ones?
So that's a great question. And that's an amazing place to be when you have too many people that are excited to be on the board. There's a variety of different ways that I've dealt with it. I'm sure there's other ways that others have dealt with that. One is one of the good practices in terms of selecting board members is having any recruits talk to multiple people that are currently on the board to kind of get a sense of what the new board member, potential board member, what they could bring, what they think their strengths are, what type of time commitment they have that's available, to kind of set up the stage in terms of really this is where our board is, and each board is really different. So some boards are going to be able to absorb new board members and it's going to be great, and some boards are it's going to be a little bit of a challenge to bring on new board members, and kind of the dynamics are going to change. It's nice to also set expectations. So if you expect a certain number of meetings to be attended, if you expect a certain level of donation, if you expect participation in any committees, just lay out those expectations and conversations with other board members before you bring them on. It sometimes helps not weed out people because they're not good people, but because they may not be a good fit for the board. So that's one way to do it. Another thing that we've done, and I've done in the past with boards, is when there's too many people, is you look back at that intentional set of characteristics that you really would like to bring onto the board, and try to map out the potential new people with, looking at their experiences and their skills and say, oh, these people really match, and really help to prioritize those people in terms of recruiting them and bringing them on board. It helps a lot, if you don't already do this, to have the bio or a CV of the potential board member when you're doing that exercise. So if you have their bio, or, if you ask them in an email to just send, these are the bullets of the reasons why, or the skills I bring, or the experiences I bring that I think are really relevant, that helps with that mapping exercise. Another thing to do sometimes, because you don't want to turn people away, I think that's kind of the biggest part of your question, is think about other ways to engage them. So maybe they're not a great fit for the board, but maybe they're an amazing fit for an event. Maybe they're a really amazing fit for doing some outreach. Maybe they're a really great fit for one of the committees. Maybe you have a development committee or a finance committee that really needs some other community members to help with the work of that committee. And that person may not be on the board fully, but could be a committee member and still contribute. Maybe you have a volunteer role that they would be better fit for. So sometimes you can sit and map out people's experiences and skills and say, these people really fit well with what we're looking for on our board, but yet these people really fit well with, our volunteer corps or our development committee, or, we would keep them engaged through our listserv, and there's just think through all the different opportunities to make sure you don't lose that enthusiasm for supporting the board. I think that you don't want to do that ever. And lastly, if you're thinking far enough in advance, like if you have term limits that are 1 to 2 years, you can go back to people and say, look, right now we're really full and we have a great opportunity, but so maybe not this year, but would you be willing to come back in a year and talk to us? We would love that. So I hope that answers the question a bit. If there's more, let me know. Are there any other questions? That was a good one. Okay, thanks, Lisa. Great. I will then move on to kind of the last section that I was going to talk about, and it's multifaceted. Once you've got your board, you've done some intentional recruiting, you've mapped out, who you need on the board, you've been able to recruit them, you've brought them on, you've done some assessments of both the current board members and of where the board wants to go, and you're kind of thinking through that, thinking through what your path looks like. One of the big pieces that is really hard sometimes for people who are on boards to do is that outreach. And this could be for fundraising, this could be for events, this could be just to raise awareness of all the services that the library provides. This could be, this is really the core of that ambassador role, right, is outreach. And one of the things that I find a lot with boards is that they don't really think through the types of materials that they provide board members to be able to do outreach. And there's, some people come to the board and are really knowledgeable about what the library does and knows all the programming. And some people come to the board and they're like, I don't really know. I've never even stepped in the library, or I've been in the library, but I don't understand all the offerings. And so this piece, this tool that I'm offering, or set of tools, is just to help think through different ways to make sure that you've empowered the board members and those ambassadors with the right pieces of information. The first one is kind of coming on board, when you first come on board of a new board, it's really important to have a board book. And I offer in the materials on the conference website, I offer a couple different tables of contents for different types of board books that I have put together. These board books usually include an overview of the library, programming types of books, whatever you would normally put together in terms of like a promotional materials for the library. It should also include board meeting minutes for at least the last 3 or 4 board meetings, just so that the new board member has a sense of what have the conversations been around, what have been the issues that community members have brought up, what are the issues that the board is struggling with. It should also probably include some of the financial information, especially if your board is one that has that fiscal oversight function. It should probably include any bylaws that the board has that kind of directs the roles and responsibilities. If you have a set of board member roles, responsibilities, and commitments type of document, that would also be good to include. And I think this is kind of one of the most important kind of introductions to the board that can really help set the stage for a new board member, their ability to be committed and involved and feel like they understand what's going on versus one that kind of comes on and is a little bit lost. I also like to recommend that once you have new board members on, to take the meeting after you've voted new members in, to take a minute and just go through that board book with the entire board. It helps refocus the entire board kind of back on the basics of what the board is doing and what they can do. Other types of information, if there's programming that's coming up, if there are events that are coming up, if there's initiatives that the library is taking, it's really great to make sure that those board members are, understand what those are. And as board members, to ask those questions during the board meeting, like, well, what's coming up down the line that I should know about? Or, make sure that you are up to date on what's going on the website. Joyce shared with me a lot of the websites, and there's some really great pieces of information, and some are really dynamic, and making sure that you as board member are kind of up to date on that. The last piece is one that, it seems a little bit funny to think about, but it really helps to have an elevator pitch. And while this seems really corporate and weird, really being able to speak to the importance of the library from a personal perspective and from a perspective of engaging the person you're talking to, especially new people, that really is a powerful tool in your role as being an ambassador, is being able to write your own kind of elevator pitch, or do it as a group with the board, and then be able to deliver it. So that's the next tool I'm going to talk about, is the elevator pitch. I have a little video that I'm hoping will work. I will play in just a second, just that has 6 different tips on writing an elevator pitch. I thought you guys would want to not hear my voice for a few minutes, so I have found a nice little video to kind of go through 6 different ways of writing it. And then after the video, I'll talk a little bit about how do you actually practice that, and how do you make that something that kind of rolls off your tongue all the time, and becomes normal. So let's see if I did all this right. Please bear with me. I'm not a technologically super savvy person. Oops.
Sarah, I think we're not seeing the video.
Oh, okay.
I wonder if it's the issue with not sharing your sound.
Let me try. Okay, let me do this. I'm going to unstop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to share it again. Thank you for letting me know.
And make sure you click sound, share
Yep.
system sound. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. I'm going to stop it there. And I know that it seems a little bit far-fetched. Who is the speaker on the video? I don't know. I'm embarrassed to say. I'm sure I can find out. I can find out and let you guys know. It could be Daniel Pink, yes. Sorry, I chose it because I thought it was a good way to just kind of concisely look at the 6 different ways that you can actually write one. I think it's important to just think about not necessarily coming up with this slick, amazing corporate elevator pitch that you're going to share with everybody, but I think it's more about the process of thinking about how do you actually talk about your library and how do you actually talk about why it's so important to you and why do you volunteer your time to be on this board and to be a part of the library community. So I like to think that, you know, I've had boards I've worked with that say I'm never going to do an elevator pitch, and that's fine. But I think it's an important kind of way to think about using that material and the different information that you have about the board, about the library, in a way to sell and to engage with people in your community. The last kind of tool that I was going to talk about is once you've gotten that elevator pitch down, or you have a way to talk about the library, it's great to practice, right? It's really nice to be able to say something and it's not clunky and it's not, it doesn't take time. And for newer board members in particular, it's important for practice. People who've been around the board for a long time or have been working with the library for a long time, they know how to talk about the library. But a nice tool for practicing and during one of your board meetings or is to pair up and to practice your pitch together. Now in person, you can do that in circle and kind of just have 2 circles. And even if it's just 4 or 5 people walking around each other, practicing in pair, it gives you an opportunity to practice with different people. If you do it in an inner circle and an outer circle that kind of goes around and practice in pairs. On Zoom or on Teams or on Skype, it's a little bit more challenging. But you can have people kind of practice to the screen and then people can give feedback or thoughts. So I'll stop there. Are there questions on kind of the idea of outreach? I didn't get into, and we can if we have time, and we can ask some if people have questions around how do you transfer some of the outreach work that you might be doing to a more virtual platform. And I think that's something a lot of organizations are kind of thinking through and struggling with right now as it seems longer and longer of a wait before we're able to kind of get back together and do some events or do some outreach that's not virtual. So I don't know if there's any questions around this idea of outreach.
Sarah, this is Joy. I just wanted to say that we're still seeing the YouTube. So if you want to switch back to your PowerPoint.
Yeah, I do. That would be great.
Right, thanks.
Thank you for letting me know.
Mm-hmm.
How about now?
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for being patient with me, everybody, with my technology. Yeah, virtual outreach is a big question. I think I can, in the packet, on the last page, there's a list of different, events that people have started to come up with. Things like, I'm going to say them and my kids laugh at when I say this, but things like a virtual front porch chat, where you have a board member who each board member invites 2 to 3 people, and it's just an opportunity to virtually have a chat at any time. It could be a morning chat and have everybody bring coffee. You could be an evening one where it's more like a happy hour and just talk about the library and what the library is doing. And you try to charge from that chat, you charge people with the kind of homework of going out and talking to 2 more people about the library and what's going on. And that's kind of like that, using that multiplier effect, and still, trying to bring people around together. I know some boards that are having house parties, and if anybody's really interested in what a virtual house party looks like, there's some really great websites, and I'm happy to share those as well, where you have intentional activities to get to know each other. This is or to promote an idea, or to fundraise, and there's questions that people can ask, and you bring together as many different people as you can get to, who you can convince to join a virtual house party together. And then you have like intentional icebreakers, and you have intentional questions, and you have different activities around whatever the convening idea or thing is, so fundraising or outreach or whatever. There's for fundraising, there's quite a few different websites, and I'm happy I could update the materials that I have if there's interest in kind of virtual fundraisers. There's a lot of people and organizations in the nonprofit world really talking about how do you do virtual, raffles and auctions and kind of those virtual events around, runs or walks or, a book-a-thon, and how do you do those together and use kind of the virtual world to do those. If you go to the Nonprofit Council website, they have an entire section on that they're kind of bringing together as many of the different ideas that their membership have come up with in terms of doing both nonprofit virtual outreach and nonprofit fundraising virtually. So I hope I've sparked a couple ideas there. If there's more questions, specific questions, I'm happy to talk about those as well. No? Okay. The effective and intentional marketing communication. Yes, no, this is, I think the idea of intentional marketing and kind of outreach is a hard one. I find with a lot of nonprofits I work with, there's the disconnect between, those that are really engaged in the mission, like the library, and really, thoughtfully and professionally engaged in, the operations of a library and making sure it's in a great organization and fulfilling the mission. And then those side things like marketing and promotion that, there's a whole companies that do that. And so thinking through just kind of simplifying what does it mean to have an intentional, outreach and marketing is really important. And if there's interest for how to do that, the Nonprofit Council and Nonprofit Ready both have really great ways to think about how do you do a communication campaign and how do you do a marketing campaign. Oh, that's really great. Fundraising ideas around during COVID-19. That's a great, that I'm sure there's a great set of ideas in there. So definitely check that out. Other questions around outreach? I'm so glad you guys are using the chat function. That's fun. All right. The last thing I was just going to do is kind of bring it all together around this idea of being a board ambassador or library ambassador. We talked about the kind of the intentional recruiting, the kind of looking at your network and mapping that network to that intentional recruiting. We talked about individual assessments of board members and self-assessments, and then an assessment and a planning for the board as a group together to kind of be on the same path. And then we ended up talking just about how all the different ways you can do some outreach and what you need, the materials that you might need, and then what that could look like. So I hope there were some useful tools in there. That was all that I had planned. And so there's quite a bit of time for questions and answers if people have them. I really appreciate the opportunity to have spoken to you, and I hope I've sparked a little bit of interest and curiosity and some great ideas that you can take back to your boards and use and try and see how they might help. Are there other questions or comments that people might have, or issues that may not be related to this idea of ambassador that your board has struggled with, that you'd like to just bring up and ask, and I can see if I have any advice or if
And a reminder that people on the phone can press *6 to unmute themselves. So feel free to do that and ask a question or make a comment. And anyone else can chat or unmute yourselves at this point and share your comments or questions verbally.
I do know one of the things that Joy had brought up that was challenging for some boards is just the idea of conflict of interest in smaller towns. And in the packet of material that I offered and is on the conference website, I do just have a basic checklist of just things to consider that really starts to try to talk about, if there is a potential conflict in a small town and in a place like the library, it may not be as big of an issue, especially if there's transparency. And I think that for many boards, the idea of transparency is more important. Like if, you have you as board member have an affiliation with a particular organization that may be giving services to the board or to the library, I think being able to articulate that before decisions are made and either, being able to pull yourself out of that or not, those decisions that are being made, I think is more important than trying to avoid it altogether. I think, being transparent about, your affiliations, how there might be a conflict before they become an issue is a much easier way of managing that than saying, no, we can't have that person on the board because there potentially could be a conflict. And I think, the checklist hopefully kind of helps to walk through what that transparency can look like. And one of those questions you might want to ask to make, just to help with the transparency. Don't know if there's other questions. If not, I've given you back a whole half an hour of your life today, which I like to reward you for. Yes, Joy.
Sarah, this is Laura.
Oh, hi, Laura.
I had a question. I oftentimes will get trustees asking about how they can encourage reluctant trustees to do a lot of what you've been talking about this morning, the outreach, being the ambassador. I think there are some folks who like to be on boards just to be on boards, and the work that you're talking about is they're reluctant to engage in. So do you have suggestions for ways that board members can entice their fellow board members to engage in what you've been talking about today?
Absolutely. I think this is one of the more challenging things, and some of the tools that I've already talked about, part of the reason I've offered them is because there is that reluctance. I think that self-assessment is really a good one, because I think, if everybody on the board has to do a self-assessment where they walk through and think about, am I actually engaging in this particular expectation that the board has of me? And some people are going to be honest and say, no, I'm not. And some people are not going to be honest. I think, that is a good starting point. I think assigning people, tasks and functions in small steps and making sure there's equity across the board in terms of, like, you're going to be doing X and you're going to be doing Y and you're going to be doing Z. And that kind of, and then checking in with people as they move forward with those particular functions, that group accountability sometimes can motivate people. And by assigning tasks, you offer the opportunity to somebody to take responsibility and take pride in something. So people, if you can be proud of something you've done, that sometimes helps. I think the biggest tool is around term limits. And I don't know if trustees all have term limits or not. Part of the reason term limits exist is so that if a board member isn't, engaged, you have an opportunity to naturally let somebody move away from the board without it being around, without having to have that confrontation or the hard conversation where it's like, well, you're not performing, right? It's just, your term is up and we're going to look for somebody new. Thank you for all that you've been able to offer. But if you don't have that in place, it's hard to put in place retroactively, but you can, and there are boards that do that, where the board will say, okay, now starting next year, we're going to put in a 2-year term limit, and people actually have to actively say, we would like to stay on for another term. And if you don't actively do that and show that you've been able to achieve all of those expectations that the board members have, then we will ask that you don't come back. The last one that I would say is if your board doesn't have a list of like roles, responsibilities, expectations, and commitments that the board members have to make to be on the board, I would encourage you to come up with one. There's a session that I do I've done with quite a few boards that need kind of reinvigorating, where you kind of look at the 4 areas that board members need to be engaged in, that, governance and financial oversight and outreach and kind of advocacy or fundraising. And you, as a group, come together and think about, okay, what is our board, our particular board, not necessarily general board, but our board's expectation within each one of those different 4 categories for the board members as a group. And then use that as a way to start to come up with your kind of maybe 1-page checklist of this is what I would expect and the board members to commit to, and these are the roles and responsibilities. Because once you have that in place, it's easy to have some of those harder conversations that you might need to have with board members if they aren't reaching those expectations. And there's samples of those in the packet of information. I hope some of those helped. Any suggestions on advocating for term limits when a board does not have them? Yeah, that's a good one. It depends on the size of your town, but I think that the biggest reason to have board, a good way to advocate for them is really around make sure that there's a diversity of voice and voices on the board. And so by having term limits, you're allowing for there to be a turnover in the voice on the board to make sure that there's representation from all the different demographics of your town. I think it's also important to talk about bringing in new and younger generation, right? So a lot of times boards are made up of people that are retired because they have more time. And so trying to figure out a way to encourage younger community members to participate. It's easier to say to somebody, you're only really having to commit for a year or 2 years than saying, come onto the board and it's kind of as long as you want. So by putting board, term limits in, you're both enabling the board to talk to new board members in a way that's much more concrete and doesn't feel as overwhelming, but also it encourages kind of the turnover that needs to happen to keep excitement for the board and for the library alive in the community. I hope that helps a little bit. Any other good questions?
Sarah, this is Joy. I have a question about when you're talking about doing these things and having some of these sort of challenging conversations of having somebody live up to what they're supposed to be doing. Would be the board chair doing that?
Yes, I think the board chair should definitely be the one to take the lead. In some cases, the board chair may, if you guys have a kind of an executive committee or, you have the librarian and the board chair, the board chair might want to have a conversation with more than one person about how that conversation can go so that the conversation is best heard, right? Because you want to make sure that it's not, well, it may turn confrontational, but it's more around we would love to be able to pull out your experience and skills that you really do have to contribute to the library. And we want to make sure that you're feeling fulfilled in your role. And right now we don't feel that is happening. And we would like to see how could we help make that happen, right? And so being able to have that type of conversation, the more you can kind of brainstorm how you frame it might be better. But yes, it should be the board chair unless the board chair is the person in question. And then it might need to be a smaller group of other board members that come together to kind of figure out how to broach that topic with the board chair. Those are good questions. I tend to try to frame things in terms of an appreciative versus a depreciative way. I'm a big believer in appreciative inquiry. So, when having those difficult conversations, thinking about these are the things you've done really well on the board, but these are the things that we really need you to help step up, and kind of couching it, that what are they called? The compliment sandwich, kind of, bringing up, we really want to make sure all that you contribute to the board is good. And these are the areas we really would like to see you strengthen. Might be a good way to frame some of them. Any other questions? Yep, appreciative inquiry. I'm a huge, and Champlain College is one of the places that has one of the largest collection of information, and it's a great way to start to help frame tough conversations, or even thinking about your board. Like, every board and every person has some amazing strengths, and being able to find those and build from those when you're looking at the areas in need of strength building really helps people to engage, right? If you have a conversation that starts off, you're doing this wrong, this wrong, this wrong, just like teenagers. I have teenagers in my house. They kind of slink down and think, oh my God, I don't want to listen to this anymore. Whereas if you're like, you're doing great in this, and I really appreciate this, but this is where I'd really like to have a conversation about how can we build that up to be as strong as this? It's a much easier conversation, hopefully. Okay, if there's no more questions, really great to be able to talk to everybody today. I hope some of the information was useful, and I hope some of the tools that are offered, you guys can adapt and use it as appropriate in with your boards. So thank you very much. Have a great weekend. I hope there's going to be some nice warm weather before we get back into fall, and you guys all get to enjoy it.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for coming.
Have a great afternoon.